everyone. I'm Artemis Javanshir, co-chair of the FEZANA Religion Education Committee, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to today's presentation by Mr. Afshin Sepehri entitled Ferdowsi's Faith and Beliefs. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat box, and Azadeh Hormozdiari and I will do our best to address them during the question and answer session. Additionally, please note that this session is being recorded and will be available on the FEZANA Religion Education Committee's website. I have long admired Mr. Afshin Sepehri's work. He has created Shahnameh audio recordings, which for many years served as bedtime stories for my younger daughter. He has also authored several captivating children's books on Shahnameh stories in both Persian and English, which are available for purchase on Amazon. Personally, I always anticipate his Shahnameh storytelling sessions through the Alefba group, where he expertly intertwines storytelling, poetry, and insightful discussions on the story's deeper meanings. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Mr. Afshin Sepehri to you today. Afshin Sepehri is an active volunteer in the public service domain, especially when it involves the Persian and Iranian culture and community. In 2005, Afshin co-founded Radio College Park, the longest-running Persian podcast, and in 2018, with the community's help, he expanded its activity and renamed it Radio Iran Shah, now a part of Alefba Group. In 2014, Afshin founded the Seattle Iranian Choir, now a part of Alefba Group, and has directed the ensemble ever since. He is also a member of the Seattle Peace Chorus. In 2015, Afshin co-founded Tankash Discussion Group, now a part of Alefba Group, and with the help of the community, extended its service to a larger community in 2018. Afshin is passionate about Persian literature, especially the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. He is the producer of the audio book series, The Stories of Shahnameh in Persian and English, and the author of the children's book series, The Stories of Shahnameh, published by Alefba Group. He has held several lectures and storytelling sessions on the topic in Iran and the United States. He gives regular talks at the Seattle Shahnameh Study Group and was the instructor of the Shahnameh and Epic class organized by Alefba Group. Afshin is a member of the Persian and Iranian Studies Program Advisory Board at the University of Washington and is a speaker and a member of the advisory group at the Persian Poetry and Music Workshop of Seattle. He was also a member of the organizing committee of the Seattle Iranian Festival between 2015 and 2018. Afshin was the co-founder and the first president of the Iranian Graduate Student Foundation at the University of Maryland in 2003. Afshin Sepehri has a PhD in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Maryland and works as a principal software engineer in Washington State. Mr. Sepehri, we are delighted to have you with us today, and we are eager to hear your talk. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for the warm introduction and the opportunity to speak. I'm very happy to be here with all of you to discuss Shahnameh and Ferdowsi. The topic of my today's talk is Ferdowsi's faith. The word faith has multiple meanings, but here we are specifically talking about religion. Although I'll touch briefly on Ferdowsi's personal beliefs, the main focus of our conversation will be on religion, which aligns well with the purpose of this group, the FEZANA Religious Education Committee. In my talk, I'm going to raise some questions and try to answer them to some extent. However, I would like these questions to be some food for thoughts for you. Also, some of the topics I will touch on would not be limited to Ferdowsi and can be applied to anyone at any time. That's why I share some examples related to other figures and hope it is useful to shed some lights on the topic. One more thing to clarify upfront is that I don't intend to conclusively determine what Ferdowsi's religion was. That isn't the purpose of my talk. It's essential to recognize that after more than 1,000 years, it's impossible to accurately determine Ferdowsi's true religion. Some evidence points to him being a Muslim, while other evidence indicates he might have followed Zoroastrianism. We also have scholars in both camps. This debate is primarily between these two religions because at the time Ferdowsi lived, most Iranians were either Muslim or Zoroastrian. We also see discussions about which branch of Islam Ferdowsi might have followed if he was Muslim. Was he Shia or Sunni? And if Shia, which faction or sect exactly? I'll delve briefly into these nuances as there is a reason why these questions are significant. Let's start with a more general question. Does it even matter what Ferdowsi's religion was? Or to phrase it differently, who really cares? I believe there are two main groups of people interested in this question and would like to elaborate on them a bit first. The first group believes that the creation isn't separate from its creator. When they see a work, a book, movie, or any other creation, they naturally wonder about the creator's identity, beliefs, family, and background, feeling that knowing these aspects is essential to enjoying or benefiting from the creation itself. This mindset applies to Ferdowsi as much as it does to others. Let me give you an example, far removed from poetry and literature or Iran. An example from Hollywood. Tom Cruise, a prominent Hollywood actor, is a member of the Church of Scientology. This religious group has faced controversy, and people believe that its actions has negatively impacted Mr. Cruise's personal life, including his 2 marriages and his relationship with his daughter. Because of strong opinions about Tom Cruise's beliefs and behavior, many people refuse to watch his movies, even if they are great movies, which some of them are. They simply can't enjoy them. Similarly, some people can't read or appreciate Ferdowsi's Shahnameh unless they believe Ferdowsi shares their own belief and faith. A Muslim or a Zoroastrian may enjoy Shahnameh only if they think Ferdowsi's belief align with theirs. It might seem surprising to some of you, but people with such strong convictions have existed throughout history and continue to do so. Now, let's talk about the second group of people who are more interesting than the first group. This group, who also care about Ferdowsi's faith, believe that Ferdowsi was a great poet who played a significant role in Iranian culture, history, national identity, and the Persian language. They deeply admire Shahnameh and Ferdowsi, and they hope that Ferdowsi shared their religion. They wish he had the same belief as theirs because they want to leverage Ferdowsi to promote their own faith. They want to be able to say, Ferdowsi was a great person who followed our religion, so you should consider embracing it, or at least appreciate it. You may be skeptical of this, thinking it's unlikely, but consider this. There is a massive industry today that is built around this concept, and that's marketing and advertising industry. Let me provide another example far removed from Ferdowsi. A few weeks ago, I saw a big poster at an airport promoting a restaurant chain. It featured Lionel Messi, the famous soccer or football player who many consider the greatest of all time. He was sitting in front of a giant hamburger, looking at it eagerly. What's the message here? Who's the target audience of this ad? This advertisement aims at those who believe that since Messi is such a great soccer player, he must also have good taste in food. There is no research to back up any correlation between soccer skills and food preferences. Yet people see this poster and feel compelled to eat the same burger as Messi, trusting his supposed endorsement. This second group of people who we are talking about here use the same strategy, associating Ferdowsi with their religion to promote their beliefs. They are like marketers connecting Messi and the burger to sell food. Now, what makes this group more fascinating than the first one is that they are not just wishful thinkers who hope Ferdowsi practiced their religion. They actively try to convert him. What do I mean by that? Let me give you another example, this time not far from Ferdowsi. Consider the Persian poet Attar of Neyshabur, who lived about 200 years after Ferdowsi. But before diving into Attar's example, I need to briefly explain the different branches of Islam. Many Iranians are already familiar with the Sunni and Shia branches. But for our Parsi and non-Iranian audience, here's a brief overview. The primary difference between Sunnism and Shiism is that Sunnis believe that after the Prophet Muhammad's death, the four rightful successors or caliphs, Khalifa, were Abu Bakr, Umar, Usman, and Ali. Shia Muslims, however, believe that only the fourth caliph, Ali, was the rightful successor because he was Muhammad's cousin, and according to Shia belief, was introduced by Muhammad as his successor at a specific event. The Shia also believe that Ali's descendants are the legitimate leaders of the Muslim community, known as imams. While caliph is more of a secular term, the religious concept of imam means that Ali and his descendants are not only rightful leaders, but also the authoritative interpreters of the Quran. There's much more to the differences between these two Muslim branches, but I don't want us to get bogged down in details. Just remember that Sunnis believe in all four caliphs, while Shia only recognize Ali out of the four. Let's get back to the Attar of Neyshabur. Attar was known for being a devout and strict Sunni. His beliefs are expressed throughout his works, where he praised the four caliphs consistently. Remarkably, in several of his books, he devoted the same number of verses to praise each of the four caliphs. For example, in the Conference of the Birds, he devoted exactly 23 verses to each of the four caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Usman, and Ali. However, when we examine manuscripts of Attar's works from the centuries following his death, we notice a pattern. The verses praising the first three caliphs gradually diminish or vanish altogether, while those praising Ali, the fourth caliph, increase in number. The number of the praise change, the nature of the praise changes as well. The first three caliphs receive more subdued recognition, while the verses about Ali become much more grand and enthusiastic. What does this tell us? It suggests that people, possibly the scribes who copied the manuscripts or those who directed them, altered Attar's works deliberately to shift his perceived beliefs from Sunni to Shia. by removing praise for the first three caliphs and emphasizing Ali. They aimed to revise Attar's religious stance. This example illustrates why I describe the second group as activists. They actively attempt to modify historical religious associations to fit their narrative. So let's return to Ferdowsi. Did this kind of alteration happen to his work, Shahnameh, as well, over the ages? Of course. Before delving into what the Shahnameh manuscripts reveal about Ferdowsi's religion, let's introduce the concept of Shahnameh editing. If you've heard me speak before, you may already be familiar with this field. The scholars and researchers analyze every single line of Shahnameh, trying to determine which verses are original and which were added by later hands. This is crucial because different ancient manuscripts of Shahnameh contain varying words, verses, and even entire stories. This makes it quite challenging to pinpoint what Ferdowsi originally wrote versus what might have been added or even omitted by later scribes. Alterations occurred for various reasons, including dramatic flair or stylistic improvements. But the most significant and fascinating reason was ideological. People modified the Shahnameh to reflect their beliefs, wanting Ferdowsi to affirm their ideology, particularly concerning religion. This is why passages in the Shahnameh that touch on religion, especially Ferdowsi's own faith, display significant disparities across different manuscripts. In the preface of Shahnameh, after praising God and wisdom and discussing the formation of the world, the people, the sun, and the moon, Ferdowsi addresses his own religion. Let's delve into those lines and see what insights we can gather. According to the existing manuscripts of Shahnameh, Ferdowsi claimed to be a Muslim. But what kind of Muslim? That is a matter of debate, depending on which sources and manuscripts you consult. Similar to Attar's case, some lines in the Shahnameh praise all four caliphs, although in fewer verses than Attar, just a few lines. However, other manuscripts feature a few verses praising only the fourth caliph, with no mention of the first three. This suggests that people might have altered Ferdowsi's words to align with their beliefs, fitting the pattern we've seen about Attar. It's impossible to definitely determine which verses are authentic and which were added later. Scholars holding different views, with some firmly arguing that Ferdowsi was a Shia and that the lines praising the first three caliphs were added later. Many contemporary scholars in Iran echo these sentiments, although it's not easy to argue against the Shia stance due to the religious nature of Iran's government today. Other scholars, however, believe that the original verses praising the first three caliphs are authentic, suggesting Ferdowsi included them to please Sultan Mahmud, the Sunni ruler to whom he presented his work. They find it hard to believe that Ferdowsi would praise his own Shia beliefs while offering his work to a devout Sunni like Mahmud. Throughout the 50,000 verses of the Shahnameh, there are perhaps only a very few that explicitly address Ferdowsi's own religion. Some scholars believe these verses were strategically placed at the beginning or end of Shahnameh books, which seems to have been 7, to appeal to Sultan Mahmud or his court. Others argue that mentioning his own religion amidst unrelated stories is too out of place, reinforcing the belief that these verses were added later. Another group of scholars question the language of those verses or their location in the text. This brings me to the point I wish to challenge. Some scholars today assert that Ferdowsi was certainly a Shia Muslim, but I question that claim. How can anyone be sure of Ferdowsi's religious beliefs based on these verses, which may not be original? This uncertainty is rooted in the fact that the oldest Shahnameh manuscripts we possess today were written at least 200 or 250 years after Ferdowsi's death. So why is it so hard to believe that verses could have been altered or added to the Shahnameh by Iran's religious community of that time? Many scholars admit that additions occurred, but how can we be sure they weren't more changes before the oldest manuscript we possess today? It's quite plausible, perhaps even probable, given the atmosphere of Iran in those 2 centuries, as well as the Shahnameh's content. Within the Shahnameh's 50,000 lines of poetry, apart from a few isolated verses, there are no clear traces of Islamic ideas. However, the Shahnameh is full of references to pre-Islamic Iran and its religions, primarily Zoroastrianism. While I'm not claiming that Ferdowsi was Zoroastrian, I'm raising questions about the difficulty of determining his exact religious affiliation, as I mentioned at the outset. The book is filled with pre-Islamic themes, which leaves room for debates about him being a Muslim. Dr. Mahmoud Khaliqi, a scholar who lived in my city, Seattle, until his passing 6 months ago, wrote a book titled Avesta in the Shahnameh. This fascinating book compares concepts from the Avesta with Ferdowsi's references in the Shahnameh. It identifies parallels in icons, ceremonies, mythology, and other aspects of Zoroastrian tradition. It's highly plausible that Ferdowsi was very familiar with Zoroastrian traditions, if not actively following them. Even if we assume Ferdowsi was a Muslim, further questions arise. His exact name remains uncertain, with different sources referring to him as Mansur, Hassan, or Ahmad. His father's name is also unclear, possibly Hassan, Ahmad, Ali, or Ishaq. These names are Arabic names. However, his grandfather or great-grandfather was most likely Zoroastrian, as inferred from his potential name, Farrukh. Thus, Ferdowsi's family would have likely converted to Islam, possibly Ferdowsi's father or grandfather. Ferdowsi lived in the 10th century, about 300 years after the emergence of Islam in Iran. Contrary to the narrative promoted by certain governmental sources in Iran today that claim Iranians warmly embraced Islam when the Arabs invaded, historical evidence paints a different picture. Many historical documents reveal the brutal killings of Iranians who were forced to convert. It wasn't a joyous affair. People were beheaded, and towers were constructed from their severed heads. In some areas like Khwarazm, people were executed simply for being literate, as recorded in Tabari's historical accounts. The early centuries following the Islamic conquest were marked by widespread violence, a period Dr. Zarinkoub calls the 2 centuries of silence in a book with the same title. During these first couple of centuries after the Arabs' conquest, people converted to Islam mostly to survive. However, after this period, the initial Islamic dynasty, named Umayyad dynasty, gave way to the Abbasid dynasty, which ruled the Islamic world, including Iran, during Ferdowsi's lifetime. The Abbasid rulers were generally more favorable towards Iranians, and people did not need to convert purely out of fear for their lives. However, there were still other motivations for many to convert to Islam. Let's consider modern-day Iran. Today, religious minorities in Iran face discrimination and are often regarded as second-class citizens. They are deprived of certain rights, including fair inheritance, diya or blood money, and employment. That being said, Zoroastrians currently fare better than some other groups, such as the Baha'i community, who suffer from severe discrimination and persecution. Given the present reality, why is it so hard to believe that discrimination was present during Ferdowsi's time as well? At least we know that subject to a special tax called the jizya. Non-Muslims had to pay this tax to maintain their religious practices. At least the tax, at times, the tax became so burdensome that it forced many to convert, even if only superficial. Believe it or not, the jizya tax persisted until roughly 150 years ago, until the reign of Nasruddin Shah of Qajar. The law was finally abolished thanks to Manikji Limji Hatarian, the representative of the Zoroastrian Parsi from India. He negotiated and lobbied the court for over 2 decades until the law was rescinded. The Parsi community ultimately paid the tax on behalf of Zoroastrians in Iran. Given this oppressive tax and the broader discrimination that minorities faced, it is understandable that some people converted to Islam on the surface, if only to avoid penalties or have a better life. But what does that mean about their true beliefs? Would we still consider them Muslims in spirit? Research shows that over time, future generations psychologically align themselves with the new religion, often becoming stricter adherents than those who forced the initial conversion. Yuval Noah Harari touches on this phenomenon in the last chapter of his book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, which I highly recommend. Ferdowsi's family might have declared themselves Muslim to fit in with the norms of their time, but it's not easy to understand what kind of Muslim they really were. Ferdowsi's writing in the Shahnameh are entirely about Iran's pre-Islamic virtues. The words of his critics also show that Muslim clerics and authorities despised him for praising Zoroastrian traditions. There are also other aspects to consider when evaluating whether Ferdowsi was a Muslim or a Zoroastrian. But let me conclude with this. We should be prepared to question any assertions about events from 1,000 years ago. Don't take it as a fact if someone insists that Ferdowsi was Muslim or Shia. However, please note that I haven't claimed that he was a Zoroastrian either. What I'm suggesting is that we should all aim to be part of a third group, the one that believes Ferdowsi's religion shouldn't matter. In the same way that Tom Cruise's religion is irrelevant to our enjoyment of his films, Ferdowsi should be appreciated as an author for his masterpiece, Shahnameh, not his personal beliefs. What matters is Shahnameh and its message. Despite the many references to Zoroastrian symbols and traditions, Ferdowsi didn't advocate exclusively for Zoroastrianism. Instead, he championed morality throughout the book, which is what made Shahnameh special. When you compare Shahnameh to other national epics like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, you notice a difference in tone and focus. The Iliad begins with a call to recount the wrath of Achilles. In contrast, Shahnameh opens by praising the creator and then immediately praise wisdom, making morality the cornerstone of its narrative. Ferdowsi praises this virtue and discusses other values that stem from wisdom, like justice, honesty, loyalty, and truthfulness. He emphasizes that morality is universal and shouldn't be confined to any particular religion. Ferdowsi intended for everyone to embrace these moral principles. Additionally, he cherished his homeland, Iran. Ferdowsi deeply loved Iran, and his entire book, Shahnameh, is dedicated to the country's kings, heroes, and people. Throughout the ages, Iranians were unified around symbols like Shahnameh and the Persian language, to which Ferdowsi contributed significantly. If we examine Ferdowsi's beliefs, we see that unwavering commitment to the Creator, morality, and Iran, as evident by the number of times the words Yazdan, Kherad, and Iran are repeated in Shahnameh, each more than 1,000 times. In the end, let me offer a different perspective as well. If you see someone today who insists that Ferdowsi was definitely a Muslim or Zoroastrian, just smile and affirm them. If that's what motivates them to read Shahnameh, so be it. Consider the context of Iran today, shaped by the revolution that ended over 2,500 years of monarchy around 45 years ago. Imagine going to the new rulers of Iran, the clerics and ayatollahs, and telling them you want to publish a book called Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings. What do you think their reaction would be? They could have easily rejected it, as they did with many other Iranian icons banned after the revolution. But instead, you could say, by the way, this poet was a Muslim, a Shia Muslim. Just look at the verses at the beginning of the book praising the Prophet and Ali. Interested, they would say, let's publish it and promote him. If that's all it took to have Shahnameh published on a large scale, enabling generations of Iranians to learn about it, then it's a good thing. Today in Iran, Shahnameh is published and taught in schools and universities. People deeply love it, as it guides them back to their heritage, helping them understand the virtues, beliefs, and morality their ancestors cherished for ages. If a few verses help facilitate this appreciation, so be it. Even if Ferdowsi had to write some lines identifying as a Muslim, let it be. You may know that another poet, Daghighi, had begun converting Shahnameh's reference from prose to poetry before Ferdowsi, starting with the section about the emergence of Zoroaster, Zarathustra. Unfortunately, he met a tragic end, allegedly being murdered by his own servant. Others who recounted pre-Islamic Iran's stories met similar fates. Ibn al-Mughaffa was one of them. Additionally, we know that earlier versions of Shahnameh written before Ferdowsi, narrating the story of pre-Islamic Iran, did not survive. So if Ferdowsi wrote about his devotion to Islam in Shahnameh to save his book or his life, so be it. I hope we can all be people who don't judge a creation by its creator. But if others do, that's fine too. When discussing Ferdowsi's beliefs, just remember his dedication to two things: morality and Iran. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sepehri, for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. Your dedication to preserving and promoting Ferdowsi's legacy through your work is truly inspiring. I know everyone is eager to dive into the question and answer segment of your discussion. As mentioned earlier, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and we will facilitate the discussion by posting as many questions as time permits to our esteemed speaker. The first question I have in the chat box pertains to illustrations in the Shahnameh that depict Chinese figures. And the question is, was it illustrated during Abbasid dynasty? Do you have any comments regarding the Chinese features that have been used in illustrations of Shahnameh?
So these illustrations were created, if I'm not mistaken, maybe about 500 years after Ferdowsi. And this is simply just art. It has nothing to do with the Shahnameh itself. It's not that my characters were Chinese or Eastern. No, it's just the style of art that comes from China, comes from the East during the Seljuqi and later years. And the artists that those depictions, they knew just how to apparently just draw Chinese faces. And that's the way that they did it. This is the kind of miniatures that were created during those years and ages, but has nothing to do with the context of Shahnameh and whether they believe that Iranians back then looked like this. So in one of the recent stories that I narrated in my Shahnameh class, the story of Rostam and Sohrab, in one part of that, when Sohrab asks question from Hujir, who's his guide in Iran, as Sohrab is trying to find his father, he points to Rostam, asking Hujir whether he is Rostam, or actually who that person is. He does not even mention Rostam. And Hujir responds that he is a Chinese hero, Chinese warrior that has recently come to Kekabus's court. And there are theories about why Hujir mentioned Chinese. So his main goal, of course, was not to reveal Rostam's identity, but why Chinese? There are multiple theories. One of them is about maybe his derafsh, his flag that has basically an icon of an ejderha, a dragon, and that could have been a Chinese symbol. And the other theory is that Rostam was from Iran was not confined in this borders that we have today. Maybe so because of the mix of those people in the East, they looked more like Chinese. Even today, when you look at people from Sistan, they look more Eastern than the people who are in the West. This is yet another theory. But when we refer to the pictures of Shahnameh, of Shahnameh Tahmasbi or some others, this is just coincidence, or basically this is how artists knew how to draw people.
Thank you very much for that explanation. We also have someone wondering where they can purchase the book you mentioned about Avesta in Shahnameh. Is it in Persian or in English? Maybe Sherkat Kitab has it?
Yeah, so that's one of the challenges that we have. So unfortunately, Dr. Kharighi has passed away, and his book was published, I think about 15 years ago, and he published it with a publisher. I'm not sure who that was, but they do not have many copies, and unfortunately, it's also in Persian. I'm in contact with his family. I'm encouraging them to see if they can republish that valuable book and maybe even translate it to English. So, but unfortunately, this is not easy to get a hold of. So I was lucky to have one copy myself.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, I'm wondering maybe you can check out Sherkat Kitab. They may have a copy
They
there.
might. It's quite possible. So I can check who the publisher is. I did not pay attention to that.
I also have another question for you. It says, in your opinion, is the verse ما گویی که آتش پرستان بودند
Magwid.
پرستنده پاک یزدان بودند from the original version of the Shahnameh?
مگویید آتش پرستان بودند پرستنده پاکی یزدان بودن. Yes, this verse is in Shahnameh, and again, as I explained, so there is no way for us to 100% say which verse or line was authentic or not. But this, according to many of the scholars and in many of the, is authentic and exists today. So this does not necessarily mean that Ferdowsi was Zoroastrian. Again, we don't want to go too far, but of course, Ferdowsi was favorable towards Zoroastrianism for sure. We see that from his words. And he was not as much favorable towards Islam, except those few lines that I mentioned that are questionable. So when he talks about Islam, so which is obviously at the end of Shahnameh, we see at least two places. One of them is in the letter that Rostam Farrokhzad, the commander of Iranian army, writes to his brother. In that, and in another place where they talk about the envoy from Saudi Arabia to the court of Khosrow Parviz and how they presented Islam. In both of these places, you see some sarcasm in the words. So, for example, when he says that the envoy talks about Islam, it doesn't say much about the virtues of Islam and what they are going to offer. But they say that, okay, they gave all kinds of promises about the other world, about, I don't know, the rivers of milk, about the beautiful women and things like that, which obviously is not the best way for you to defend a religion. If he was a devout Muslim, so this does not align with those verses.
Thank you. I have another question. It says, it is believed that Sultan Mahmud had commissioned Ferdowsi to write the Shahnameh. Why would the Sultan commission such a work when the stories would be that of Zoroastrian kings?
This is absolutely nonsense. This is untrue, as I mentioned it many, many times in my speeches. So Sultan Mahmud did not commission the book, and there's this very simple reason for it. It's just mathematical. Ferdowsi started Shahnameh. I say these dates in Hijri, Qamari. You can convert that by adding 600 or so to it to become basically the Western dates. But at the time that Ferdowsi started the book, it was around the year 370 after Islam. But he finished the first edition of his book in 384. And then Sultan Mahmud became king in 389, 5 years later that the publish of the first edition of the book. How come he could have commissioned the book? It's absolutely nonsense. It's impossible. And Ferdowsi also mentioned that in Shahnameh. It says that I wrote this book for 20 years to find who's worthy of my words. And again, we can talk about why even Ferdowsi dedicated his book to Sultan Mahmud. There are reasons for it. So one simple reason is that this was customary, and it was the way to make sure that his book survives, because he needs a sponsor. He needed somebody who basically commissioned his books to be written. Not there was no printing press back then, but that was the only way that people could write and make it survive. And even though Sultan Mahmud rejected it for multiple reasons and never published it or promoted it, but still, Ferdowsi's work was so good, was so appealing to Iranians that it survived without the support of anybody. And Ferdowsi mentions that at the end of Shahnameh. He says that people came to my house and somebody just read from Shahnameh and the others wrote it. So it was already multiple copies generated. And this basically multiplied over the years. And that's one of the reasons that we have all different kinds of manuscripts. So I told you about the motivations of people to change verses of Shahnameh, sometimes ideological, or other reasons. But we also know that one of the reasons is that people wrote it by hand, people made mistakes. And also, as I mentioned, there were two editions of Shahnameh in two different times, 384 and 400. These are the two dates that we know. So, of course, there were differences between the two. And some people even believe that Ferdowsi until his death, around 411 to 460. So that's why we have different narrations, different copies that are vastly different. And this is a challenge of our time.
So I think you largely answered the next question that we have, but I'll read it just in case you have more to elaborate. It says, please explain why Shahnameh was written 250 years later after Ferdowsi, or was distributed 250 years later, question mark.
No, sorry. I think it was a misunderstanding. I did not say that Shahnameh was written 200 years after that. The oldest surviving manuscript that we have today is from that time. Of course, Shahnameh was written many, many times during or right after Ferdowsi's death, but all of those manuscripts disappeared. And of course, we have reasons for it, right? So we have Mughals and others who attacked Iran over the years, and there were so many times that books were burned in Iran. This is so sad. This is a sad part of our history, that when Arabs attacked, when Mughals and then Timurids and others attacked Iran, they burned books. I mentioned that in my talk, that in Khwarazm, they killed people just because they knew Pahlavi. They did not want anybody to be able to even read the books. They burned the books, and whatever book that survived, nobody could read them. They killed those people. So, and that's what happened. And of course, that's the reason that not many books exist even from before Islam. So some people argue that, oh, Iranians did not write much back then. No, they did, but they burned them all. So, and that's why we were lucky to even find some of these old manuscripts. And the one that we have, the oldest one, which is from 614, is from Florence in Italy. And it was found by accident. Somebody was looking into the books, and it was categorized as a copy of Quran. They looked at it and said, wait a minute, this is not a Quran. This is a Shahnameh. And that is from that time, which is more than 200 years after Ferdowsi. And unfortunately, even that book is incomplete. It's just the first half of the book. So the oldest one that we have today is in a museum in London, which is about, again, 50 years after that. So these are the problems that we have. It's not like nobody cared about Shahnameh. They did a lot. So we have narration from Nizami Aruzi, so one of the Iranian authors, who recounts his visit to Ferdowsi's tomb and Ferdowsi's basically village about 50 years after Ferdowsi. And he mentions that everybody loved Ferdowsi, and he himself praised Ferdowsi deeply. And we see others, like, for example, Asadi Tusi and others, write poetry books, write epic stories after Ferdowsi, following his footsteps. And they all praise Ferdowsi and love him. So it's not like Ferdowsi was unknown. But of course, at some point, in some era in our history, it was not easy to talk about Ferdowsi or promote him because of all the religious leaders and hardliners who believed that Ferdowsi praised pre-Islamic Iran, praised Gabra Khan, praised Zoroastrians. And because of that, it could not be easy to talk about him or write his book or talk about it, but still, it survived. That tells us a lot about how deep Shahnameh was in people's hearts. That despite all of these pressures and the oppositions, this manuscript still survived, and we can still read and enjoy it.
Thank you so much. The next question says, can't the scholars determine from the style of writing and vocabulary as to what is original and what was added later in the Shahnameh.
I think you were caught a bit, but I think I got the gist of it. So the question is whether we can tell what verses are original or added later based on the vocabulary, based on language. Absolutely, yes. So that's one of the means for Shahnameh editing. So Mr. Feridun Jonaidi, who's one of the Shahnameh scholars, in his book, he mentions 27 different means and tools that we have in our toolbox for analyzing Shahnameh and deciding which verse is authentic, which one is not. And definitely vocabulary is one of them. And I did not want to spend much time about basically giving all the evidence about whether Ferdowsi was a Muslim or not a Muslim. So there's a long set of literature about this. And depending on who you listen to, they come up with some arguments. But vocabulary is one of those things that is very questionable about those verses in which Ferdowsi talks about his own religion. He uses some words that are only used in those verses, only once in the entire Shahnameh. The word da'im, the word wasi, and many more are just the words that are not in Ferdowsi's jargon. He doesn't use them. So the word Allah is only used once in the word Allah Akbar, and it's in the time of Alexander, which is really weird to be there. So Alexander is definitely before Islam. He said that, okay, people came to praise and they were chanting Allah Akbar at the time of Iskandar. Come on. And that one is most probably just added or is based on where the Iskandar stories came about. So they come from the Arabic source and potentially it comes from there. But other than that, you do not see the word Allah in Shahnameh. But as I mentioned, the word Yazdan or Izad or Khudavand are repeated many, many times. Yazdan above all of them, more than 1,000 times. The other ones around 500 times, 200 times, 70 times. But that's one reason. So, and many scholars today reject many of the verses in Shahnameh, not just these verses, many of them because of the language. So I see that argument saying that, okay, this whole story is added to Shahnameh because of the frequency of the Arabic words that we have in them. I need to note that it's not like we do not have any Arabic words in Shahnameh, because some people get surprised seeing one Arabic word, said, oh, wait a minute, so this should not be it because in Shahnameh, because Shahnameh is all Persian. No, it's not. So we have maybe about 500 Arabic words in Shahnameh, but comparing that to maybe hundreds of thousands or millions of words, this is very minuscule, very small. But still we have them. But I've seen arguments from scholars that reject an entire story just because the number of times that Arabic words are repeated in those stories are way more than other stories. They say that, okay, this is obviously a later language. Persian language gradually evolved to have more and more Arabic words in them. So that's why even in our language today, we have many more Arabic words than Ferdowsi and Ferdowsi's.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could perhaps talk a little bit about Shahnameh and perhaps the Zurkhanes in Iran. Were there a reason to keep it alive? And the fact that it was in poetry, just like the Gathas, would that have an effect on us being, having it available today?
Oh, that's so far away from the topic of this talk, and I have not done much research on Zurkhane. What I can tell you is that Zurkhane or Naqqali or things like this, which are basically ceremonies and traditions that we have today, obviously they also have roots in Iran's tradition, old traditions, but they gradually changed over time from maybe Zoroastrian background, maybe from a secular background to become more and more religious and Islamic over the years. If you listen to what they talk about in Zulkhane today, they all praise Muhammad, and they have all kinds of chants and all kinds of Islamic symbols in them, even writings on the shirts or even on the percussion. So all of that are Islamic today, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have any deep root in Iran. So because we see that heroism, like for example, the big hero of Iran, Rostam, and others, they're valued and deeply respected throughout the ages. So this was promoted as one of the values, one of the virtues of Iran. But again, over the years, it has changed. So for example, in Naqqali, when we talk about it, so it originally started with those ghost sounds that existed even before Islam, and they narrated those old stories, and some of those stories survived and they ended up in Shahnameh thanks to those people. But over the years, they also started adding stories from the religious background, from the Islamic background. The story of Ashura and Ali and Hussein and all of those were added to that. We have some Taziyah, which is like kind of like Naqqali as well. But still, we have a mix of the two. And sometimes when we look at Naqqali, it's so funny sometimes that these two concepts are mixed together. Like, for example, they say that Rostam came about and said, Yo, Ali. So what? Rostam said, Yo, Ali, whatever that means. But they told that story. So people enjoyed it, people listened to it, and they love Rostam, they love the religion, and they basically loved that and just enjoyed it and attended those sessions.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I have, I guess, one last question in the chat box that perhaps is also related to Ferdowsi's belief. It says, what values do we take away as we read the Shahnameh?
So I mentioned that. So at the end of my talk, I mentioned that there are two things that we clearly see in Shahnameh: morality and Iran. And this is something very unique. So, and for both of these, we see some uniqueness in Shahnameh. Let me elaborate a bit on that. So, of course, we always need to compare Shahnameh with the similar works of other authors and other nations. So we can compare with Leon Champeau or others, Siegfried, see that those epic stories mainly talk about the heroism and what some great heroes and people did, killing people and just conquering lands and things like that. But in Shahnameh, Ferdowsi takes a different approach. He uses these stories to give us lessons. So in the beginning, at the end, or even in the middle of those stories, Ferdowsi speaks his own mind. He gives us advice. And this advice is related to those stories as well. If somebody gets defeated because they did something wrong, Ferdowsi uses that opportunity to tell us that, see, he did something wrong and he did not have a good destiny. So he always talks about this throughout the book. And sometimes there's nothing but advice. It's amazing. When you look at the end of Shahnameh, the second half of the Shahnameh, the Sassanid era, when you look at that, there are stories of some kings. And it seems that Ferdowsi did not have much stories about them. There was not much in his reference. So what we see here is that he starts their story saying that, okay, this person, this man became king after his father. And he started by just asking all the heroes and all the commanders to gather around, and he started giving them advice. And then he gives his advice in, let's say, 20 verses. And then he said that, yeah, he then ruled for a few years and he died. And before he dies, he gave this advice son, the next ruler. So we have one of them is, for example, 41 verses for one king, and only one of them is the story. He ruled and died. And the rest of them is advice. Ferdowsi did not miss any chance to give us those advice. And the beauty of his work is that, as I mentioned, those advice are universal and they apply to art today. There is nothing in Shahnameh that you can see that, oh, this advice that Ferdowsi gave is old. No, it's nonsense. No, they all apply to our lives today, and we can use it. And the other one, the Iran and praise of Iran, as I mentioned. So we have our nationality, our language, to some extent, a great extent, because of Ferdowsi. And again, compare that with other works of other authors. We see them, they usually talk about just this tribe, that tribe, the fight between them, and they usually even address one generation or two generations. But Ferdowsi talks about the entire history of Iran, from the beginning of time, the first king, Qumars, all the way to the time that the Persian Empire was abolished and Arabs conquered Iran. He tells the story of 50 kings throughout generations, and is all about Iran. Iran is the main point in the middle of all of that. That's the main pillar. And that's also unique about this. And that's why people love Shahnameh, even today, more than any time before. So, because people would like to believe that Iran still exists, still is valued, and that's what we need to look up to and maybe fight for.
Thank you. There's a question that different dynasties were mentioned in the Shahnameh. Was the Parthian dynasty mentioned in the Shahnameh? This Ashkanian.
Very briefly, very briefly. So the one dynasty that is not in Shahnameh whatsoever, and that's a very surprising thing, that is a Achaemenid dynasty. So Hakamanishim, they are not there. But there's a very brief mention of Parthians. But Ferdowsi says that I do not have much sources about them. So I just heard some names. And he quickly mentioned a few names in a few verses, and then reaches the era of the last king of Parthians, who was Ardaban. And the story of Ardaban, Ardashir Babakan, who basically defeated him and changed the dynasty to the new dynasty of Sassanid. So that's the story that we have, John. However, that doesn't mean that Parthians were missing. So Parthians showed up in a very mysterious way in Shahnameh. Many of the heroes of Shahnameh today, they believe they were just the Parthian kings. We have the story of Gudars and Giv. Those are Shahnameh heroes. Those are the commanders of in the era of Kekavus and Kekhosro. But we have Parthian kings with those names, Gudars and Giv. And interestingly, Giv was the father of Gudars in the Parthian era, but now here we have Giv, the son of Gudars. And we have other references to it. We have Furud, we have Bahram, we have others that we can trace them into the Parthian era. And many of the stories that we have are the Parthian stories. The story that Daghighi started and Ferdowsi included in Shahnameh comes from Yadigar Zariran, which is the oldest epic story that we have that survived from Iran's past. And that is from the Parthian era. And we have that narrated in Shahnameh as well. And there are others too. So we see that Parthians were present, but it's understandable if after such a long time since their time, and also, of course, with the Sassanid dynasty who replaced them, and they wanted to, again, eliminate any trace of Parthians as any other conqueror did. So there's not much mentioned about it.
So we have time for two more questions. I'll go ahead and ask those. How much of Shahnameh is from Khodainameh?
So that is another mm, mm, part that is not very clear. Different scholars have different opinions. Some scholars believe 100%. They say that Khodainames were the source of Shahnameh of Abu Mansur, which was written or basically translated from Pahlavi to Persian by 4 Iranians Mubad during Ferdowsi's lifetime. And then Ferdowsi turned that reference from prose to poetry. That is the belief. Some believe that, yes, it was mostly that, but there were some other references that were added, some stories coming from other sources. We have that opinion as well. But Khodainames were absolutely present, and they were the main source, we can say, of Shahnameh. But one thing we need to remember is that we did not have a single Khodainameh. We had multiple of them, and each of them with their own even ideology. We have had some Khodainames which were written in Sassanid king's court. So then obviously they were the ruler's narration. But we also have some others which were more favorable towards Iranian hero, like Rostam. And we see, for example, between Kavus and Rostam, all the arguments, all the facts between them, in most of them, Ferdowsi is in favor of Rostam. So that Rostam was right and Kavus was wrong. So it seems that maybe it comes from a source in which rulers did not have the highest moral ground. So these are all, again, speculations, because we do not have Khodainames, unfortunately, but definitely Khodainames were the main source for sure.
Thank you. And do you have an most accurate English recommendation for a most accurate English translation of the Shahnameh? Do you have a recommendation?
Yeah, I can tell that Dr. Dick Davis, the professor of Ohio State University, has a book that he finished maybe about 10, 15 years ago. So yeah, you have that book. Yeah, this book is what I recommend if you want to read the story of Shahnameh in English. One interesting thing that he did was that because he's also a poet, some of the verses he also translated in form of a poetry. So this is good to read, even though there are a few missing stories from that as well. For those who are not very hardcore readers, I can also recommend a book by Hamid Rahmanian and Mahmoud Sadri. That book is basically illustrations come from Mr. Rahmanian, which originally comes from Shah Tahmasp. But the narration of the stories, which are not the entire Shahnameh, it's just very small portion of the Shahnameh, and that narration is very brief, is by Dr. Mahmoud Sadri, which is part of that book. If you want, especially to give a gift, that's a good book to give.
Thank you so much again, Mr. Sepehri, for this amazing talk and discussion. I think the most important thing, like our most important prayer, Ashen Vuhu, it is the content and the message that we have to take away. And the content and the message of the Shahnameh is what we need to take away when reading it. And we hope to benefit from your knowledge in the future and are grateful to have had the opportunity to learn from you. A big thanks to our audience for joining us today and for making the discussion portion of the talk amazing. Also, many thanks to Mr. Arzan Wadia, Mr. Arzan Lali, and Ms. Azadeh Hormozdiari for their assistance with this talk. We look forward to seeing you at our future talks. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you so much, Afshin.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.